Good afternoon. I'm thankful for the opportunity to be up here to give this lesson to y'all. Um, I'll try not to put you all to sleep. I know it's the afternoon, everyone just ate lunch, but it's hard to follow a lesson that TJ just gave. It was a great lesson this morning. But with that, if you'd like to follow along, we'll be in Genesis chapter 45. That's where we'll be at this afternoon. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So I like a good story in the Bible. I like reading about stories. And there's several stories in the Bible that when I read it, they just kind of touch my heart a little bit. They make me feel good. And a few that come to my mind, we got Samuel, Moses. His mother saved his life by abandoning him in the Nile bulrushes. Mother's love is something that goes beyond anything that we can fathom, right? But the main one that comes to my mind when I think of story is the story of Joseph. Now, did you know that the story of Joseph has some of the most words in space given to it in the Old Testament? There's only a few other people in the entire Old Testament who have more space dedicated to their story. And maybe you're wondering, why? Why did God pick Joseph to give so much narrative to? It's a great story, but God has a purpose for giving it to us. So there's three questions that come to mind when I read the story of Joseph. The first question was, why did God use so much Bible space for Joseph? We read in Romans 15, verse 4, "For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we may through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope." So if volume is important to us or has any significance at all, then the story of Joseph is a top priority for us. The second question, when Joseph became the second most powerful man on the planet, why did he not go see his fathers or his brothers? He was in that position for 7 years of good and plentiful times and 2 years of famine before his brothers ever went to see him. And never once, at least that we read, did he think, I'm going to go see my family, go see what my brothers are doing. They lived less than 200 miles away, which, during that time was a lot of distance. But, he's the second most powerful person in the world. He had the resources to do that if he wanted to. So that was a question I always had. And the third question is, why would God choose 12 men as rough as the brothers of Joseph to be the founders of Israel? For 1,500 years, they were God's chosen people and known as the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 tribes named after a band of brothers so mean that they sold their own brothers into slavery after a debate of whether or not wanting to kill them. All right? So let's get into these questions. First question, why so much space? The reason I think that there's so much space is because God wants us to see and understand his providence. And the providence of God is what we're going to be talking about today, because this story is a perfect example of it. Let's read Romans chapter 8, verse 28. That's Romans chapter 8, verse 28. "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love the Lord and those who are called according to his purpose." Sometimes, especially when we're young Christians, we read that verse and we think, maybe all things work together for the good of our souls, for our eternal good. But it doesn't mean right now. Not at this very moment, not in the present. Sometime down the road, it'll all work together for good. Then we grow and we mature and realize that Paul meant exactly what he said. All things, the good, the bad, the ugly, the wise decisions we make, the not so wise decisions we make, no exceptions. All things work together for good to them that love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. And that God will see to it that the troubles of this life work out for the good of every person who loves him. He speaks to us and calls us through his word, which is perfect for us, right? And the story of Joseph definitely speaks to us, especially if you look at it in reverse. So let's take a look at it. So Joseph is in Egypt, right? Second most powerful man on the planet. He's essentially the prime minister, I guess you could say. He's in charge during the 7 years of plenty. He's storing up grain. Then the famine comes, and he's also in charge of dishing it out, not only to the Egyptians, but to other countries as well. And then his brothers show up for that grain, and Joseph was able to help them out, to provide deliverance to them, and bring his family down into Egypt. Now, why was Joseph able to do all this? Because he saved up the grain, right? Well, why did he save up the grain in the first place? Because Pharaoh appointed him to do that job. And why did Pharaoh appoint him? because he interpreted a dream, the dream about the 7 fat cattle, the 7 lean cattle coming up out of the water and eating the 7 fat cattle. And why had Joseph interpreted that dream to begin with? Because he had been in prison, and Pharaoh's servant overheard him interpret another dream. Remember the butler? He said, you interpreted this dream, so when I get out of here, I'm gonna remember you. But, of course, he didn't do that. And, if he had, Joseph would have been released and long gone, and that would have, he would have been out of the picture right there. But the butler forgot, and God used that. It just shows that even the forgetfulness of man, God can use for good, for his purpose. Anyway, why was Joseph in prison in the first place? He was in prison because he had been in Potiphar's house as a slave. Potiphar's wife continually tried to get Joseph to commit adultery, but Joseph wouldn't commit that sin. So she gets mad and makes up a lie, and Joseph is put into prison. Something to think about, at least something I think about when I read this, is Potiphar's actions is a little unusual, if you think about it. At least I think so. It seems to me Potiphar knew his wife and knew Joseph, and that's why it's not the end of Joseph right there. I would have guessed, reading something like this, that typically someone would have been killed for something like this. I mean, it's hard to say. It's just a thought that I had. But anyway, why was Joseph in Potiphar's house in the first place? Because the Ishmaelites sold him to Potiphar as a slave. And then why did the Ishmaelites even have Joseph as a slave in the first place? Because they bought him from his brothers back in Palestine, right? First, his brothers wanted to kill him, but Reuben, his brother, the eldest, said, let's put him in a pit. And then Reuben's idea was actually to let him out. But when he returned, his brothers had already sold him. Seems like a bad thing, right? But think about this. If those merchants had not passed by at that particular time when Reuben was gone, then Joseph would have been released. He never would have even gone to Egypt at all. God's purpose depended on these merchants passing through at that particular time. And, to end it all, why did Joseph's brothers even hate him enough in the first place that they made him want to kill him? Because their father was partial to him. There's a number of reasons why his father was partial to him, but the first and foremost is that he was a child of his favorite wife, Rachel, who died giving birth to Benjamin. And Joseph had a dream, of course, of the sheaves bowing down, which meant his brothers were going to bow down to Joseph, and his brothers didn't like that at all. So the first opportunity they had, they got rid of him. And the craziest part about this whole story is that is the first reasonable thing that's happened to Joseph. Out of the whole story, that is the only thing that's reasonable. His brothers didn't like him, so they wanted to get rid of him, which is crazy to even think about. But that's the story of Joseph. Every incident of his life depended on the one before it, and God guided it. He guided it whether the people involved knew it or not. And as far as we know, from what we read, God only touches that story twice, right? Other than the fact that God gave Joseph supernatural powers to interpret 2 dreams, otherwise it was a natural course of events from what we read. A natural course of events that work towards God's purpose. So to answer the first question, why did God use so much space to tell the life of Joseph? To let us know that his hand is in all of it. And regardless of what happens to his children, which is us, it is God who makes it work out for good. So that's the first question. Now the second question. Question 2, why did Joseph, when Joseph did eventually get out of prison and became the second most powerful person in Egypt, why did he not go home? And, personally, I think the answer to that question is pretty easy. He didn't want to. I mean, why would he, right? He wanted to forget about his home, to be completely separated from the thought of everything that had happened. His father had a reason to think he was dead, and from what we know, his father made no effort to try and go see him. He wanted to forget the whole group, that entire piece of his life. And that's actually evident because look at what he did. He's married, he has a happy home, he has power, money, influence, he has a child. What does he name his child? I'm probably going to say this wrong, but it's Manasseh. Right? He named his child Manasseh. And what does that mean? What does that name mean? It means I have forgotten. He's saying, I have a new life. I have a wife. I have a boy. I've forgotten my old life. I'm free of it. And then, one day, his brothers show up. They need food. Now, Joseph had issued an order that all foreigners must come back to see him before they get it. I wonder why he did that, right? Maybe a coincidence. I don't know. But they come before Joseph, and I don't know what was in Joseph's heart at the time when he did that, but we can see it wasn't very kind, right? He says, "You're spies." And they said, No, we're not. They said, "We're the sons of one man who has 12 sons. It's 10 of them are here. One of them's not. It's Joseph. And the other's at home." And Joseph immediately thinks, "Oh, that's Benjamin," right? Now, I think when Joseph heard that, he was touched right at that moment when he heard about Benjamin. Because here's the thing about Benjamin. That's his only full brother that he has. The rest are half-brothers, and they're older. But Benjamin was also the closest in age to him. And him and Joseph had the same mother. And Joseph wanted Benjamin to come to Egypt with him. And that's why he plays this game with the brothers. He says, "Unless you bring the other brother back, you'll be treated as spies." So here's Joseph with money, power, position, influence. He's thinking, "I want Benjamin here with me. And the rest, I want him gone. I want him on the other side of nowhere. I want nothing to do with him." So they do what he says. Joseph puts the cup in Benjamin's pack so he can keep Benjamin. He can identify Benjamin. And the rest of them he can get rid of. Brothers, fathers, all of them just gone. But he loves Benjamin. He wants the innocent, full brother to be there with him, right? So the plan plays out. They find the cup in Benjamin's sack. And the brothers, they think they're dead, right? And while the brothers are in prison, Joseph overhears Reuben. In Genesis chapter 42, verse 22, we see Reuben say, "I told you guys, we shouldn't have harmed Joseph all those years ago." And it shows to me how heavily that event weighed on Reuben all those years. Because remember, Reuben wanted to release him in the first place. He didn't want to kill him. But it plays on Joseph as well, too, because this is the first that we know of that he's heard of Reuben trying to save him. Joseph didn't know this. And it's the first that he's heard of any of his brothers having any decency regarding him at all. And then later, Judah actually steps up and says, "Take me instead of Benjamin. He's innocent. Take me." Now, Joseph is a wise man. And finally, he sees it all for what it is in the end, right? Genesis chapter 45, verse 5. "But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourself because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." He says, listen, don't hate yourself because of what you did to me. You intended to hurt me, but God intended to use me to save you from this famine that we have. That is the first time that we read that Joseph knew what God had in mind. And honestly, Joseph really didn't see the even bigger picture, the grand scheme of things, that he just saved what would become God's chosen people. Which leads us to the last question. Why would God select, out of all the men on the planet, a group of men mean enough to sell their own brother into slavery, and then let those men be the founder of a new nation? These brothers are pretty rough around the edges, you know what I mean? Well, the answer is, those aren't the men that God selected. The men that God selected are the men that's standing before Joseph and offering their lives to keep Benjamin from being killed. Those are the men that he selected. Listen, we must not judge people for the worst thing that they've ever done. You wouldn't like someone going back over your life and picking out the meanest thing you've ever done and say, look at him. Look at the kind of person he is. I know I wouldn't. I wouldn't like that. Something else to consider while we're thinking about this. Only 40 days after Peter cursed and swore that he never knew Jesus, God selected him to preach the first gospel sermon. And these brothers here, who at one time sold their own brother into slavery, they were conditioned, they were brokenhearted by the experience of life, and they were sorry. They became so unselfish that they offered themselves to give their life for their brother, which is a total different character that we see at the beginning of the story. And God said, these are the men that I want to start my people with. These are now men who are going to be ancestors to my son when I sent him to earth. Looking at that story, God's hand is in it without a doubt. He's in that story without a doubt, moving and bringing about his purpose. And today, if you're a Christian, regardless of what happens to you, it's scriptural that God will bring good out of it. It's scriptural. We say it. We talk a good game of it, right? But imagine if we didn't give it just lip service. We actually believed it. Imagine if every day we woke up and lived with the thought that no matter what happens to me, God will make it work for good. And that's why Paul wrote in Romans chapter 8, verse 37 to 38. For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor power, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. If we are faithful, God will make everything that happens to us work for good. And I'll close with this. Life comes down to, and it's all about choices and decisions. Now, there's a lot of deep, meaningful quotes about choices and how they, affect our life. And I guess most of them have some degree of truth to them, I suppose, But a good bit of them lead us to believe that if we make all the right choices, nothing bad is going to happen to us. And that's dangerous. That's dangerous because the Bible tells us different. The story of Joseph tells us different. But yet there's a bit of absolute truth in the idea that if we make the right choices, nothing bad will ever happen to us. I heard someone say one time, you never have a bad day, only bad moments. And that is true, especially for Christians, for nothing bad eternally will ever happen to us. Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Listen, we may have bad moments, but here's the catch. Bad things happen to everyone. Happen to all people, right? The very best and the very worst of us. We all have bad moments. But those who made a choice to follow Jesus, those are simply moments in the vapor we call life. That being said, if you've not made that choice today to commit your life to God, you have the opportunity to do so today. Or maybe you strayed away. Maybe you need some encouragement. You made that decision to refocus this afternoon. Come down to the front here while we stand and I was sing.